Okay, yeah, thank you very much. So we have, I think, 15 minutes or so left until checkout time, so I'll try to make this as painless as possible. So I'm really happy to be coming off the back of two really excellent talks here, because both of them have really touched on some core themes that this talk is coincidentally going to be really centered around. And so that is really just the compliance side of data and what it takes to achieve the privacy component of this whole industry. As we've kind of heard, this is not a simple thing at all. From a legal standpoint, there are huge risks to organizations who don't achieve privacy and compliance. From a data perspective, it can be extremely difficult to do without causing friction in your organization, without putting roadblocks in the way, without even sometimes just undermining the utility of the data such that it makes your use case harder to achieve. But it's absolutely essential. So what I'm going to talk about today is how this is thought about in a particular context, which is specifically health data in the United States, and not just health data, but unstructured health data. And we've heard this evening as well, unstructured data increasingly a lifeblood to organizations for all sorts of things. Huge proportions of the data ecosystem are now unstructured, multimodal, text, images, audio, etc. So you can imagine that when you have this super high dimensional data and you want to start using it effectively, it's rich with insights, it's this kind of ocean of information, you're going to run into some big privacy problems. Now, there's this concept of de-identification, which exists slightly differently in the US to maybe what is more familiar in this room for GDPR. So in GDPR, you have kind of a stricter sort of standard for, certainly for health data than you do in the US. And there's this concept of anonymization, which basically means that data has to be aggregated in order to be used without revealing people's information. For health data in the US at least, de-identification is kind of the standard you have to meet. This isn't quite as strict. All you need to do is show that there isn't any more than a residual risk that you could actually re-identify someone from the data that you have. So typically this involves stripping out direct identifiers, so anything that can automatically tell you who someone is, their name, their address, their phone numbers, driving license details, all this sort of stuff. And then the next step, once you've done the obvious, is to make sure that you're looking at the types of data that can point to an individual to within a small enough population that it wouldn't take much extra work for a nefarious actor or even a naive recipient of the data to determine who that individual is. So things like geography, the city you live in, the county, the state if you're in America, racial ethnic background, your marital status, all these kinds of things. You put them together in combination, they might be innocuous on their own, they can suddenly start to paint a picture of you, and then re-identification can occur. So what HIPAA does, third bullet point down, is the US framework that says if you want to transfer, sell health data and not be subject to the extremely strict provisions that are in the Health Act, you have to de-identify this health data. And you do this by either prescriptively removing out chunks of information or making statistical transformations on the data to ensure that your chances of actually doing those kinds of transformations is very small. So all of this is pretty standard. This has been going on for 25 years. What this looks like in practice, we'll just skip on for time's sake, is you might have a situation like this where, skip over here, you've got various combinations of individual information, so a year of birth, 5-digit zip code in America, and then depending on where you live, if you live in a small populous state, maybe the risk level is much higher than it would be in, say, California, etc., etc. So you can start with statisticians and data scientists to build up this picture of what the risk level is in a data set, how you might actually identify someone from it, and then eventually through consensus in the community, empirical research, you eventually get to this point where there's some threshold that people loosely agree on as a good heuristic to say, now we're satisfied with this very small risk territory. So all of that kind of makes sense for a structured data set. If you have a health data set or a non-health data set that's tabular and you've got easily queryable information, everything's easy to read, human beings can instantly interpret, that is all fine. Where things get much, much harder is when you move into the unstructured space and you're dealing with a scenario where maybe now your data that you're interested in is a health note that a physician has recorded after they meet you and has been transcribed into this 2 or 3 page document. And then you're an organization and you have 10 million patients, each of those patients has 100 notes, and suddenly you have this vast, vast unstructured data set. But the clinical journey demands that this information is used. There's huge, huge insights in here that you can't get from just having these well-defined structured attributes. Loads and loads of super contextually important things that can really make a difference to the patient journey. So that, coupled with the commercial interest behind this in the States, means that the drive to find ways to de-identify this unstructured data is huge. So the same kind of principles that I spoke about before are still basically there. You have the things that identify you, your direct identifiers, your names, your geographical locations, all of these things. But now they're no longer queryable and easily aggregatable as they were in structured data. So you're now in this situation where you have these fragments of information where you might have an individual whose name suddenly gets dropped in because a physician forgot to redact it themselves or not mention it. Or you might just have vast radiology reports where there's enough information referring to that individual's date of birth, the fact that they came to visit the office from a particular town in Kansas, that the information can still be brought up. So, say you've got this entirely fake health record here, there's plenty of names, addresses, and so on in there. This would be really, really bad if this was a real person. So what you want to make sure you do if you de-identify this is have something that goes through and automatically redact or at least convert into a larger inoffensive category like names, times, dates, etc. How do you do this? So we are no longer in the realm of simple statistical transformations and data aggregations. Now we need to rely on the wave of AI that is sort of revolutionizing this space. And so we've got the information about the BERT model up here, which is your core model for building a natural language processing tool that can allow you to extract information out of unstructured text. So whilst I kind of leave that up there, the interesting thing about this is that we now find ourselves in this space where AI presents a huge challenge from a privacy standpoint, because now you have these tools that exist and are getting better and better that allow you to extract information out from unstructured text. At the same time, the same technologies are super valuable from a privacy standpoint for being able to go in there and find the information that you need to redact, that no human reviewer can do at scale, and that no simple rules-based approaches can either. What you get is this kind of cat and mouse, cloak and dagger approach between people who are trying to preserve privacy and more nefarious individuals. And there's this continual race of trying to determine, are these models helping me or are they hindering me? So ultimately you kind of get to this space where you can sort of arrive at this place where redaction of text can get you pretty close to removing lots and lots of identifiers. Typically, these are paired with obfuscation strategies where you start switching people's information out where it's detected for plausible synthetic alternatives to kind of provide this extra layer of protection for the rare identifiers that do manage to avoid detection. So where this kind of leaves everyone from a privacy standpoint is a scenario where you've kind of got to a place where you're performing pretty well. You are arguably meeting the thresholds and standards that allow you to comply with HIPAA in the US. If you were trying to do this for GDPR, you would struggle a lot more because none of this would be able to be enough to be able to confidently assert that something is anonymized. So this is sort of an example of the divergence that you get in these different legislative frameworks and the consequences that it can have on the amount of free-flowing information that you can actually have in these spaces. So we'll skip on just for time's sake. So if you have a look at the kinds of like state-of-the-art models, so this is from a paper by John Snow Labs, who does a lot in this health de-identification model training space. These kind of numbers start to look pretty good from like a recall standpoint. You can end up with like greater than 90% recall for things like ages, dates, patients, names, telephone numbers, and so on. Precision in some cases can also be quite good. The challenge for a lot of individuals, though, is that simply applying these models, just at point blank, ignores a huge amount of context that this data actually has, and latent relationships that exist within the data can still tell you a huge amount of information about an individual. So unstructured data will frequently have things related to the relationships between family members that are referenced within a data set, references to an individual's circumstances of birth, references to their pathway through different educational institutions, geographical locations, etc. So even when these are applied, and even when you're getting these strong de-identification metrics, 99% recall, 80% precision, etc., you might still find yourself in a situation where there's a high level of re-identifiability. Where this becomes a problem for everyone to think about is there's naturally this trade-off that exists when doing privacy between the amount of information that you retain and the amount of use case that you retain. So if you retain too much information, privacy is not served. If you release too much information, if you are too restrictive in your privacy goals, you end up removing the ability to do anything actually useful with this data. This is ultimately quite an uncomfortable truth to exist in. There is no ideal situation that you can get to without having to make some cost. So what you typically see in the US is that de-identification requires these sacrifices for health data sets. So far, at least, there has been a general acceptance that de-identification to the standards that are set out in the US health legislative system can be more or less achieved and still achieve some level of utility, some level of utility maintenance for these data sets. Where this gets really, really difficult is where we move away from text and into cases where the dimensionality goes even higher. So cases like medical images, medical audio, so actual like recordings of interactions between patients and physicians. And in this case, the tricky balance between AI models that really help you to preserve privacy and AI models that really start to threaten it by the sake of their own ability to reach in and pull things out that human beings would not be able to extract easily becomes even more pronounced. So if you have facial data, so like the biggest example of this would be if you're taking like MRI scans, there's some information about a person's brain, enough about their facial structure that you might be able to, with certain models, match that to facial information that exists in the public domain about those individuals. Models that can help you from a privacy standpoint do things like making sure that you're taking averages of faces. So if you have 100 different faces, you combine these into a single image that still retains the amount of clinical utility that you need it to without going too far and exposing actual details about that individual. And typically, using generative adversarial networks, this could be a really quite profitable endeavor. But the same realism and efficacy that exists, or that is afforded by these kinds of models, returns you to this place of real trouble sometimes, because ultimately there's this huge latent space of information and structure that is preserved when these models are used to try to preserve privacy, that in actuality there tends to be the risk that you can invert these mappings and be able to re-identify people even after you've performed some of these constructions. And this goes doubly so for cases of like symbol blurring and pixelating out of images too. So really to the point that at the moment, the de-identification efforts in the US for medical image data tends to limit itself to cases where you don't have any information really above the neck. And then, because I see we have crossed the half-hour mark, I will wrap up by drawing attention to what is probably the most contentious form of unstructured health data in the privacy space. And this is as true in the US as it is in Europe, which is genetic data. So, unlike other forms of health data, genetic data is immutable. You cannot change it. If there is a breach of your personal information, you can hypothetically change your credit card information, you can change your name in extreme cases if you want. You can never change your genetic code. Once it's out forever. It's also true that you can't mess with this data very easily without seriously impacting research use cases. For text data, you can remove identifying information and the core clinical value is typically retained. And there'll be some false positive rate that's troubling, but nothing too serious. Ultimately, the same sort of deal with image data. With genetic information, the key value is often correlations that exist between genetic variants and mutations, which are extremely latent and very, very difficult to see in advance. And so what you typically find is that organizations, research institutions in the US need to see this bulk of data in en masse and as unperturbed as possible. So even if you know the kinds of mutations and genetic signatures that can be unique to individuals and strip them out, you risk at the same time undermining the ability to extract a huge amount of clinical information. This is a good example of where privacy legislation and data are now very out of sync with each other. So in the US at least, this governing legislation is more than 25 years old and makes no mention whatsoever of genetic information, which leaves us in an uncomfortable space where the fundamental question of what is the right balance between high utility genetic information, which is key to clinical development, and privacy preservation, which if it's followed to the extent that the law indicates, should mean that huge amounts of this needs to be truncated and removed. So without clear legislative guidelines, that balance isn't really being struck at the moment. So this presents a huge problem, and genetic information typically at the moment becomes more a case of legal interpretation and trying to make those kinds of arguments than any kind of data-driven approach. But maybe just to note that there are cases where this can be extremely significant. So people here are probably familiar with the 23andMe genetic data breach at the end of 2023, which was enormously damaging to them as a company. And yeah, you can have a look at what the consequences of that were. That being said, there is it is much harder to modify that genetic data in a way that preserves privacy. In small doses, you can do it. At scale, you have to rely on legislative arguments. So, yeah, I'll maybe wrap up there, having highlighted that. But the kind of closing thesis of this would be privacy and compliance, as we've heard tonight, hugely important. Unstructured data, massively prevalent in the sectors that we care about. Finding a way to do privacy in this space requires a very sensitive data and statistics knowledge and strategy. And even when that is applied, there are still significant limitations to what you can do. In the genetic space, to take the most extreme example, it requires very sensitive applications of security, safeguards, legal protections in order to reach those de-identification standards. But from a data perspective, it's still a huge amount of work to do. Yeah, I'll wrap up.
Just a question here. Is, like you said, is that lack of legislation or that greyness in Because that holding back research in a lot of ways, because they're kind of hindering progress.
It has the potential to. So, with genetic information in particular, there's a wide spectrum of opinion in the privacy community in the US about what can be considered permissible and what can't. A lot of it comes down to not so much arguments about what genetic data itself is identifiable, because that's pretty uncontroversial, but how much data exists in the wider landscape that could be used to link it to that information and then trigger the identification from that. The legal frameworks that currently exist make reference to the reasonable steps that are required to do those kinds of external linkages, and that typically is where conversations can still be had that permit this kind of stuff to be done. But whilst today it still allows for genetic data sets to get sort of signed off under HIPAA, to have expert determinations as they're known done, as time goes by, more and more genetic information is going to be collected, breaches are probably going to continue to happen, and more information will exist out in the larger space, and it will be increasingly risky from that point of view. And then that question of, will the law impede research, or will things be done will things be done that still open this re-identification risk, will just become ever more pronounced, I'd say. Cool. Thank you very much. Oh, sorry.
GAN generates images try to preserve the utility of, the disease or the abnormality that would be the useful components. Do they still preserve that?
Yeah, it's a good question. So, as with most of these things, it's hugely use case dependent. So there might be like a say specific patterns within an image that you're really interested in keeping, and you can train these models to specifically preserve those kinds of things, but everything else try to blur together. So it does get tricky. What usually happens when these kinds of proposals are put forward is organizations are still quite trepidatious about undertaking them for fear of exactly that, and it's quite hard to say for sure that any particular sophisticated measure for privacy will not have a downstream effect that's deleterious. So it is possible. It has to be done with sort of specificity and care, and often that is still difficult to convince people that it is worth the squeeze of it.
Is it in use or is it proposed?
Typically, these are ideas which are mostly found in the literature. You do have de-identification platforms that exist which will take images into account. Some of these models may be being used by certain organizations, but it's still quite cutting edge stuff.
Yeah. This might be a naive question, but like, is it practicable to have controlled environments, like highly controlled environments, where non-anonymized data is brought in, used to train, and then so it's disposed of or re-anonymized, and like that's a different approach?
Yeah, no, that's a really good question. So just to make sure I understand your question. So having identified data, train a model on it. This model then has a certain utility, and then remove that data, and then the model itself can be used.
Yeah.
Right.
And
so
very highly reserved, I suppose, to ensure that there isn't leaking and.
Yeah. If we had more time, there would have been slides on exactly this. So this is something that people are really looking at a lot, because exactly that kind of use case is just becoming more and more valuable. What it effectively risks happening is that the model itself becomes a form of linkage. So things that it might have learned, it risks either possibly regurgitating directly or providing, like, especially if you're talking about like an LLM, might provide the kind of insight where it might start to re-reveal certain bits of information. And now you can be quite careful and still say, like, I'm going to make sure that there are guardrails against it shooting out anything that's like a name, but it could still tell you things about an actual patient journey, which map even in a fuzzy way to something that can then reveal an individual. So generally when these things are looked at, they're looked at with a huge amount of care about what exactly the data workflow process will be, where a model is going to be used, who the model is going to be used by. There's often very strict user access controls for these things. You basically would struggle to get a situation where you could train a model on something and that model just becomes completely public if it was trained on protected health information. But yeah, fantastic.